So I'm all in. I've got aces, the other guy's got aces, and the third guy's got kings. You're not gonna believe what happens.
Let's rewind a second. That's me, Marc Goone, and I'm going back to low stakes to prove to our students and the YouTube haters that astronomical win rates are possible at 5-5. In this episode, the 2 sessions I play at Hustler Casino raise a few interesting questions. Can the out-of-line bluffs continue to get through almost every time? Will I ever actually make a value hand? And most importantly, can I stay on track to make $100 an hour at 5-5? Let's find out.
Down bad, bounce back, boy, I'm different. Watch how I handle my business. Watch with the hands not ticking. Listen, that's that drum kick, boom, coming out of my system.
All right, so let's jump into this first session at Hustler. We are playing 5-5, and we open it up to 25 and to cut off with ace-9 of spades here. The button and the big blind are going to call. And the flop is going to come 3-8-9 with 3 hearts, monotone. The big blind checks to us, and in this spot, multi-way, I just don't expect the button to be doing a lot of stabbing 3 ways. If this was heads up, I would just check. But multi-way, I'm gonna start just betting my pretty good hands myself. I'm gonna bet $30 here, going small, and the big blind is going to call. Turn is going to come maybe the blankest, most innocuous card in the deck, the 2 of spades, and the big blind is going to check it over. Usually on monotone boards, I like to do a lot of small betting on the turn, particularly with my bluffs and with my flushes here, because it gives our opponent a chance to raise off when they trapped on the flop with the nut flush, and it gives them a chance to call with a bunch of their weak hands as well. But here in this particular spot, I think especially from the big blind, he's gonna have just a lot of single ace of hearts hands here that have just the nut flush, and plus I feel like he's got a lot of 9x that just isn't folding. Maybe some hands like Jack 10 with a heart that just isn't folding. So I'm actually gonna go big. I go 160 into 135. The options I like on this turn are either very small or very big. In general, I just don't like choosing that medium size on the turn because it doesn't really accomplish anything. So I go big here, 160, and he calls. River is now the 3 of spades pairing the board, and when he checks it over, I just think we almost always have the best hand here, and we can just try to get value from all of those 9x hands. So I go 300 into 455 here. Villain's gonna think about it, but unfortunately, he is going to find the fold. Next hand here, we go 25 in the hijack with ace-10 offsuit. The cutoff and big blind are going to call, and the flop is going to come pretty good for us. 5-10-6 with a couple of clubs, so we flop top here. And when it checks over to us, again, these spots just aren't very likely to be stabbed with just one player in position. People are a little more careful with what hands they're going to bet multi-way. Now, if this was heads up, I would check all the time, going for the check raise. But in this particular spot, I'm just going to bet myself. So I go 35, and the cutoff is going to call next to act, which indicates quite a bit of strength, usually some strong draws, some top pair. Now the turn is a jack. I'm actually going to check it over because I do think he can have some traps here and is pretty much going to let me know what he has. And also, it's just going to be a lot harder to get value from hands like 9-10 or Queen-10 or hands like that when an overcard comes. So I check it over, he checks it back. River now is the 10 of clubs, so the flush does come in, but we make trips, and at this point, I elect to go small here to block on this river. It's not the best card to get value from. I just don't think he has a ton of strong hands when he checks back the turn. When we have a 10 in our hand and there's 2 10s on the board, very unlikely that he's got a 10 as well. So I'm just trying to get value from hands like pocket 7s, pocket 8s. I go very small, I go 50. He puts in the call, we show ace 10, and we are good. All right, this next one, this is how to get some thin value. The hijack limps, we go 30 in the cutoff with 9-7 of diamonds. The button, small blind, and the hijack limper are going to call. Flop comes 7, queen, 3, rainbow. This is going to check all the way around. We're going to a turn, which is a deuce of clubs, bring in a backdoor flush draw, and when the small blind and hijack check it over to us, at this point, we think we pretty much always got the best hand here, can get some value from some draws, maybe some worse pocket pairs, pocket 6s, pocket 5s, stuff like that. So when it checks over to us, we go 50 into 120 on this turn, and only the small blind is going to call. Now the river is the king of diamonds, and when he checks it over to us, I think this guy would just come out and bet on the turn after the flop checks through if he had like pocket 8s or pocket 9s or something like that, or even a hand like ace-7. I think he would just always bet on the turn. So I'm just pretty sure we always have the best hand here, unless we run into a hand like king X of clubs occasionally. But I'm just trying to get value here from hands like 6s, 5s, 4s, stuff like that. And because the backdoor flush draw missed, because the straight draw missed, I do think we can get a little bit of value here. So I go 50, we get called, and look at that, we are good. Nice little thin value bet on this river. All right, guys, if you want all of the sauce, if you want to level up your win rate, we are doing one last final boot camp in October. I know. We said we were doing our last boot camp in September, but we are not quite ready to roll out our membership model, and we want it to be perfect when we launch. So in the meantime, one last boot camp in October, 10 seats. If you want one of those 10 seats, click the link below, sign up today. Once these 10 seats sell out, that is it. No more boot camps forever. Thank you, guys. We will see you there. All right, next hand here. We have moved from the must-move table over to the main game. I'm not a fan of table change. I don't table change by choice, right? This was forced. It was a forced table change. Under the gun goes 25. The hijack calls, and we're in the small blind with pocket 9s. Usually I would consider squeezing here with an open and a call with a hand as good as pocket 9s. When you see a player limp from early position and then they open to 5x, it just means they have a very, very strong range. So I'm just gonna call with 9s here. Big blind calls. Flop is going to come 3, 3, 4 with a couple of spades. We check, the big blind checks, and now under the gun goes 65 into 100. We call, and the big blind gets out of the way. We're going to a turn, which is the 7 of clubs, and we check it over once again. At this point, we're probably considering folding here if he just blasts on this turn. Remember, very, very tight range opening from under the gun, but he actually bets 130 here, and I think this is a sign of weakness when you see guys take the double whatever the size they used on the flop. This is just going to indicate weakness a lot of the time, and if he were to bet like 200 here or 220 closer to pot, something like that, I would have just mucked pocket 9s, just giving him credit for having a big pair here. But when he goes 130, we're going to call and play some classic 5th Street chicken here, and the river is the queen of diamonds now. So everything bricks, we check it over. He quickly checks it back. We show our 9s, and of course we are good. Next hand here, this one confused the shit out of me. This guy put me deep into the blender and turned it on high speed, and I became a giant pile of mush. So in this hand, the under the gun, hijack, and small blind are going to limp. The $10 straddle is on, and we look down at pocket queens in the big blind here. We make it $75 hairs. Now the big blind, who has played what seems to be relatively snug pre-flop, is going to 3-bet to 175 here. So very small 3-bet size, but I've actually only seen him use like this kind of like click 2.3x or 2.4x 3-bet size before. He just bombed the flop and ended up having an overpair, of course, and one of the times he checked back on the flop and it didn't go to showdown, so I'm just assuming he bricked and just gave up. So this guy does have a lot of sizing tells. Queens is a good hand. We are going to call here. We're also getting like a really good price, so we put in the call. Flop comes 10, 10, jack. We check it over, and he goes 100 here into about 380. So a very small size here. I don't think this is ever going to be a hand like aces or kings. I think he would probably go bigger with those from what I have seen, but I am a little bit suspicious that this could be a hand like pocket jacks. And now the turn is a jack. So that kind of reduces my worries that he has jacks. I check it over, and he thinks for a second, and then he checks it back. And at this point, I think it's most likely that he has a hand like ace king, the small bet on the flop, and then the check back on the turn. So the river is an offsuit 8 here. And at this point, with the pot being 580, I'm just going to block and try to get looked up by ace high. The board is double paired. He may not believe me here. I'm gonna give him a good price. So I go 150 into 580, and now he raises to 450. And you hear me say here,
You got quads?
I just don't think this is ever aces or kings from the reasons we talked about before. To me, this feels like quads or nothing almost. I'm not sure he would even 3-bet with a hand like ace jack. suited. I'm not sure he would 3-bet all the time with a hand like pocket 10s, and I'm not sure pocket 10s would bet on the flop and then check back the turn. It doesn't make a lot of sense. So this really, to me, feels like jacks or nothing, right? It feels like 4 of a kind or nothing. And if he ever just gets a little bit wiggly here with a hand like ace king, just getting a little bit out of line, if I can just find like a partial of a bluff here occasionally, it's going to be a profitable call. I've seen this guy make a few bluffs so far, even though he is an older guy who seems to be playing relatively tight pre-flop. But because I think it is jacks or nothing here, and there's one combo of jacks, I am going to reluctantly, begrudgingly put in the call. And look at this, he shows ace jack of diamonds. So my assumptions were a little bit off. All right, next hand here, just another example in a vlog full of a litany of examples of how to continue fighting for pots that no one really shows an interest in and just picking up this dead money all the time. We go 25 in the low jack with 9-8 of spades. The cutoff and the small blind are going to call. Flop comes 4-5 queen rainbow here. Multi-way, we are going to check with nothing going on, and the flop checks through. Now the turn is a 4 of spades. When the small blind checks over to us, I think a lot of people here with a backdoor flush draw would just start betting, which is fine. It's okay, I guess. It can't be bad with 9 high. But the problem with just betting here is if cutoff checked back on the flop with a hand like pocket 7s or pocket 8s or ace 5 or something like that, that hand's just always going to call the turn. And unless you put in a massive bet on the river, well, that hand's going to call the river as well. And the problem is that the cutoff could have some 4x here. So by putting in a massive bet on the river, you're getting the 7s to fold a lot of the time, but you're just going to get snapped off by trips occasionally. If you check here, the size the cutoff uses, you're going to be able to tell exactly what they have because they're going to telegraph their hand strength with their sizing, especially when this board starts getting a little bit wet on the turn. So he goes 35, and we are going to put in the big boy check raise here to 185. We are going to get the check raise through and take this pot down. All right, next hand here. Think I made a blunder somewhere along the way, so let's talk about it. EP goes $15. We're in the hijack with ace queen off. We're gonna 3-bet. My MO, try to isolate recreational players, play pots heads up in position because that's where we're going to realize our edge. So I go $50 here, and the plan goes off the rails because the small blind is going to cold call. And now the big blind is going to cold call as well. So usually when people cold call 3-bet, it's gonna be a tight, narrow, defined range. Hands like pocket 9s through pocket queens, maybe some suited broadways, maybe some ace jack suited, ace queen suited, hands like that. So a pretty defined narrow range from the small blind. And now EP is going to come along as well. So we're going 3 ways to the flop, which is pretty good for us. Comes queen 10 deuce with a couple of clubs. And when it checks over to us in position, we are going to start putting in money. So I go 75, and small blind and EP call. We are going to a turn, which is the 5 of diamonds. So now there are front door clubs and backdoor diamonds. And when both players check it over to us, now the pot is 425. And we are about 600 effective with the small blind and maybe about 680 effective with EP. I think they're gonna have a lot of hands that just don't want to fold here, like king queen suited, like 10x of clubs, like king jack with clubs or diamonds. They're just gonna have a lot of hands that are super inelastic on this turn that may get very elastic on rivers. So I think just going big here is best. I should have planned this hand a little bit better. Probably just should have gone like 100 to 125 on the flop, made the pot a little bit bigger, and then the jam on the turn would have seemed a little bit less scary and they would have been more priced in. So I think that's the mistake I made in this hand. But both of these players are going to spend a little bit of time tanking, and then they are going to go fold and fold. And we rake in the pot, which is nice, but I think I somehow missed quite a bit of value here. All right, next hand here. This one shows the power of position and just how good bluffing is in live poker. Under the gun limps here. We go $40 in +1, so big ISO size here. When people limp from early position, they're not planning on limp folding. The hijack, the small blind, the big blind, and the under the gun limper are going to call. So you can tell we are in a pretty good game here. 5 ways to the flop, which comes queen 10 8 with a couple of clubs, and the flop is going to check through. Turn is a 7, which we are now open-ended. The small blind goes $100. $100 here, and under the gun calls. We are just getting a pretty good price with our open and straight draw, but it's the fact that we are in position here, that we know hijack is never gonna wake up with a very strong hand behind us unless he specifically has 7-8 suited or pocket sevens. The river is a 2 of clubs, bringing in the front door flush. Now the small blind checks and under the gun checks. And at this point, I'm just positive that neither of these players have a flush. Fear and greed are the two biggest primary driving factors in live poker, and people get greedy when they make good hands, specifically when it looks like we are probably not gonna bet on this river. So if small blind had a flush, he would bet here. If under the gun had a flush, he would bet here. I obviously think pocket nines is never good in this spot. I think someone probably has a queen, maybe both of these guys have a queen, and I think it's just very unlikely that small blind has 2 pair plus when he chooses his size on the turn. I think it's very unlikely that under the gun has 2 pair plus when he just calls on the turn, right? So we're just gonna go with the big boy size here. Pot is 500. We go 930 into 500. And look at that. We get a very, very quick fold, and we get to scoop in this pot, turning pocket nines into a bluff on this river.
We're here with Jamin Burton from the...
I gotta spit on that thing.
We're here with Jamin Burton from the Drawing Dead vlog. Hello.
How are you, sir?
Hello.
Hello.
I want to know if you think $100 an hour is possible at 5-5.
$100 an hour, very possible at 5-5.
You heard it here. You want to elaborate on it?
No, you just gotta be good.
All right, guys, this is maybe the 3rd or 4th hand so far of this vlog series where I've just gotten value owned on paired boards. I'm gonna learn the lesson eventually, but today is not the day I learn the lesson. Under the gun limps, we go 35 in the low jack with ace 10 offsuit. The hijack button, small blind, big blind, and the under the gun limper are going to call. Flop is going to come 4, 10, 8 here, rainbow. And we've got the hijack and button behind us. I think it's actually pretty likely to get stabbed. So I actually go for the check here, going for the check raise. We check, it checks through. Turn is now a 4 of hearts. It checks over to us, brings in a backdoor flush draw, and we're going to go pot here, nearly pot, 200 into 210, just targeting flush draws, targeting 8x. It's just going to call one time for a big size, and only under the gun is going to call. We think we probably have the best hand at this point. He'd probably just come out and lead with trips, or maybe check raise if he had trips. So we're going to the river, which is an 8, now double pairing the board. And when he checks it over, I think I could still get value from hands like pocket 5s, pocket 6s, pocket 7s, stuff like that here. People do get a little bit more sticky on these paired boards, on these double paired boards, specifically when you bet small. Pot is 610. I'm going to go 200 on this river, just trying to get looked up by 5, 6, 7s. He snap calls, we show our hand, and look at that. He has 4-3 for a boat. Obviously, I'm just getting a little bit too greedy on turns or rivers here on these double paired boards, so I will learn the lesson. I'm gonna tone this down. All right, last hand of this session here, and another example of why checking out of position, even in 3-bet pots, is really, really good. The low jack is going to go 25. We're in the small blind with queen jack of spades. This is good enough to 3-bet. We want to get it heads up, so we are going to 3-bet. We go 110. The low jack is going to call, and the flop comes 9-4-3 with a couple of spades here, and my MO out of position, single raise pots or 3-bet pots when heads up. I'm going to check my entire range because players in general in live poker overstab, telegraph their hand strength with their bet sizing, and they do not protect their check back range. So we are going to check, and he checks it back. I just think he's insanely capped here. He's got a lot of ace highs. Maybe he's got hands like pocket 5s, pocket 7s, stuff like that. But I think he's just gonna bet off all his good stuff. Turn is now a 6. And at this point, I'm gonna choose a size where he's going to call one time with all of his pocket 7s, pocket 8s, pocket 5s, hands like that. And then I still want to leave that chunky big boy bet behind on the river. So I want them to call with those showdown value type hands on the turn. Then we can get that stuff to fold on the river. So I go 215 into 220. He's going to think about it, but not for too long, and put in the call. Now the river is an offsuit king, which is an absolutely perfect card because every time you're in a 3-bet pot, what hands do they put you on? Well, ace king usually. He's got about 650 behind. The pot is 650, and we just think we can get him to fold all of his hands that call the turn here. Occasionally we can run into a hand like pocket 6s, but if so, good game. Otherwise, we just think we can get his entire range to fold on this river. So we jam for 650 effective, and he is going to think and think and think, and finally he is going to put in the fold. When they check back flop, you are now allowed to bluff with impunity because your opponent never, ever, ever in 12 million years has a good hand.
Just wrapped up the session. Just a super frustrating session overall. Just one of those sessions where I just couldn't make any hands at all. And when I finally did make a couple hands, just couldn't get paid in any spots. But all the bluffs got through. It is hard to lose in this game because you can just print red line. But played about 5 hours, down about 250 bucks. And that's all we got.
All right, jumping into a second session at Hustle here, showing up around noon on a Friday. We've got a straddle going, which I will take it. Again, my MO on straddles. I'm not going to push for them, but if the straddle's going, awesome. Pretty good for us. So we are going to open to 35 under the gun with ace 4 of diamonds, the hijack, cutoff, button, and big blind call. The flop is going to come king, deuce, king. And we don't really have anything going on here multi-way. We've got a bunch of players behind us in position who are uncapped. So we are going to check, but it is going to check through here. We are going to the turn, which is the innocuous 6 of diamonds. Again, nothing really going for us here. And I think on this flop, some people still in position could possibly slow play a king because the board is so static and dry. So on the turn, we're going to check it over again. And now the hijack and cutoff check for the second time. The big blind checks for the second time. And now the button is going to bet 45 into 180. And this is just a green light here. We can just pick up this pot all the time. The button is just stabbing here when he chooses this size. Of course, I think we just bet a lot of his king X on the flop. I think at this point, we can be pretty confident. The hijack and the cutoff don't have a king. We are going to lay down the hammer and actually go for a check raise here. We would like for a hand like pocket 7s or pocket 8s or something like that to call, and then we can get that hand to fold on the river. So we choose a relatively small check raise size here. We go 160, but he just snap folds. We get it through, and just fighting for these uncontested pots where people just tell you they don't have strong hands and picking up these pots all the time is really, really, really going to add a bunch to the win rate. Next hand here, this one's really fun because every time someone donks into me as a preflop raiser, so every time someone leads as the preflop caller, I just get to think I get to win this pot. So let me show you an example. We open in the cutoff to 35 with king 10 offsuit. Again, the straddle is still on for this hand, and the small blind, a recreational player, is going to call here. The flop is going to come 9-3 deuce with a couple of hearts, and the small blind is going to donk or lead out for $35. Whenever somebody donks, I generally just continue as a call. We allow them to continue bluffing their weak shit on the turn and put in another bet. They also tell us with their turn sizing if they ever do have a strong hand or if they improve. And now we get 2 streets because their bluffs are just going to go bet a lot of the time. And then we just get to raise on the turn a lot of the time with our air or draws. And so that's exactly what's going to happen here. The small blind donks again for 60 on the turn, which is a jack of hearts. And at this point, we can be fairly confident that when he chooses this size, he just doesn't have a flush. A flush would either donk much bigger on this turn or now go for the check raise. So when he donks 60, this is going to be a hand like 9x, maybe like pocket 8s or something like that, trying to figure out where they're at and set their own price. So we're going to tell him exactly where he's at. We are going to put in a small raise here because we wouldn't mind if he called actually with a hand like pocket 8s with a heart here, and then we can get that hand to fold on the river. So we raise to 160, but he is going to think about it and eventually lay it down. So when someone donks into us, we just get to win. All right, this hand here, just a really good example of how sizing tells and positional configuration can allow you to make some folds that may seem big on the surface, but are actually really, really easy in game. So straddle's still on. We open up to 35 under the gun with king jack of diamonds. The button, small blind, big blind, and straddle are going to call. Flop comes king 3-5 rainbow, and when the small blind, big blind, and straddle check to us, only one player in position to us. So generally I like to do a lot of checking out of position, but I don't think this flop is likely to get stabbed by the button. I actually decide just to bet here multi-way, treating this more as an in-position spot than an out-of-position spot. I'm gonna go $60 here on this king high flop, and the button is going to hem and haul and then eventually call next to act, and the small blind is going to come along as well. And I'm already feeling not all that great about this when we get called by the next to act player and then the second to act player. I think the next to act player could have some traps here like 3s or 5s. So we are going to a turn here, which is the queen of spades. And now at this point, when the small blind checks it over to us, I'm actually going to check to see what the button does. And now he goes all in for 255, and the small blind thinks about it, and then he calls. This is just a very easy fold. When he uses his size, when he goes all in, when he calls next to act on the flop, we just have a bunch of clues here that we are just never, ever, ever good. So we make a relatively easy fold. The river is a offsuit 10. The button shows queen 5 of diamonds for 2 pair, and he is good. Next hand here, straight 5-5. EP is going to limp. We are on the button with pocket 9s, and we raise to $35 over the limp. The big blind and the limper are going to call here, so we go 3 ways to a pretty good flop, which is 9-10-3 with a couple of hearts. So we flop middle set, checks over to us, and we go $50 here on this flop. And the big blind calls next to act, probably going to be a relatively strong range from the big blind here. And we go to a turn, which is the beautiful 9 of hearts. So we have quads, and the front door flush draw comes in. And when he checks it over, I think the big blind could just have a lot of flushes here, a lot of ace high flushes, king high flushes, etc., that would play passively on the flop. So on this nut changing card, we bet small here. We can entice him to raise off with a lot of his flushes, and also still continue with a lot of hands that are drawing dead, 10x, like ace 10 or something like that. I go $60, and he is going to put in the call. Now the river here is an offsuit king, and when he checks it over, he could certainly have a hand like king 10, right? That would call the bet on the flop next to act, and then since we went small on the turn, maybe that hand calls again with top pair. So he could have a hand like king 10 for top 2. He could also have a hand like queen jack when we go small on the turn. So I do think he has some strong hands here. So I'm just gonna ignore if he has a hand like 10x. I think that hand is folding no matter what. I'm gonna target the king 10, I'm gonna target the straights, and I go 400 here into $325, and he unfortunately is going to think about it and lay it down. But I do like the sizing on this river. Next hand here, straddle is back on. The low jack is going to limp. We go 50 in the hijack with black pocket deuces. The cutoff, who is a Brazilian pro, and the low jack limper are going to call. So we are going to a flop. It comes jack 10-9 with a couple of hearts. We just don't really have anything going on here, so we're going to check. It checks through. Turn is an 8 of clubs, bringing in a backdoor flush draw, and once again, when it checks to us, we just don't really have anything going on, and it is going to check through again. Now the river is the king of clubs, bringing in the backdoor flush, and now, obviously, we don't have any showdown value. I think we incredibly rep a hand like a backdoor flush here that would check on the turn, because the turn was a 4 card to a straight turn. We only really have to worry about the cutoff here, waking up with a hand like ace X of clubs. That's really the only hand he can have, and I think sometimes that hand may even stab the turn. So I'm gonna go for this here. I wanna make sure that we just always get the folds here. If the cutoff or low jack had some type of 2-pair hand, then we just always make those hands fold on this type of scary river. So I'm gonna go 330, but we receive a little bit of bad news, and not too long after, the cutoff decides to jam for 1.2K effective. We very quickly fold, and unfortunately we were not able to get this bluff through. Just pretty obvious here. He has ace X of clubs and decided to check back the turn, and now goes for the jam on this river. Next hand here, I am not happy with how I played this one, so let's talk about it. The straddle is on. We open to 35 in the cutoff with king 8 of spades. The big blind calls, and now the straddle makes this tiny raise to $95 here. People just don't 3-bet closing the action all that often, right? They're just more incentivized to call, even with some of their pretty strong hands like 10s or jacks or ace jack suited and stuff like that. But on the other hand, the sizing to 95, well, I don't really know. Could this be a weaker hand? I'm not really sure what's going on here, but I think getting this price in position with a suited king, we can just call here and try to outplay this guy post flop. Flop comes king 3-9, and he now bets 100. Pretty easy call here with top pair, especially when he bets less than half pot. Turn is a 6 of clubs. Now at this point, when he checks it over, I decide to check it back. This is a mistake. This guy is essentially just telling us right now that he has a hand with showdown value, that he has a hand like 10s kings, jacks, queens, something like that. So I think I should just take a small size on this turn, maybe 200, and get pocket jacks to call here on this turn, but I check it back like a big dummy. River is a deuce of hearts, and now when he checks it over, if you put an AK-47 to my head and said, you have to make jacks or queens fold on this river, well, I would probably have to bet at least $400, $500 here to get jacks or queens to fold, but I go 200 for value. This is a mistake. I think I can get at least $300, $350, maybe even $400 here out of jacks or queens. You see he calls very quickly. I am good, I win this hand, but I really hate how I played it because I think I left at least $400 on the table. Even if you win a hand, going back and reviewing like how you played it is so important, and I'm disappointed with how I played this one, but taking some notes and planning to do better in the future, get more value in this particular spot. Double board bomb pot alert. All right, so there is 175 in the pot, $25 ante. We are 7 ways, and we have 9, 9, 5, 3 here. The top board comes out deuce 6, 9, so we flop the nuts on the top board. Bottom board is deuce 6, 10, so we flop a gut shot on the bottom board. And we are starting off here in the worst position, under the gun essentially, in this bomb pot. So my MO in these spots is just to check my entire range, see what happens. If someone bets, we can maybe put in a check raise. We can just start piling money right now with the nuts and a gutter here. But this flop is going to check through. Top board is a 4 of hearts and bottom board is an ace of hearts. So on the bottom board, the front door flush comes in, and on the top board now, there is a flush draw with hearts. So if someone has hearts here, they got a pretty good hand. So we check. EP Euro reg to the left of us is going to pot it to 175. It's going to fold all the way back around to us. And at this point, when it folds to us, I don't really think raising makes a lot of sense here because I just think he always has the bottom board locked down, right? This just looks like he's got hearts all the time. We have 5-3, so we have the nuts on the top board. This is just gonna be a flush a lot. We have 0 fold equity here. I think he's just gonna have a king high flush on the bottom board. So we are going to call, and then the plan is if the bottom board pairs, we are going to donk and try to get him off of the chop. And if both boards are a blank, well, we're probably just gonna call on the river. So the river is a jack of hearts, unfortunately, on the top board and an offsuit 8 on the bottom board. Now we check it over to just do a little bit of hand reading. Makes a lot of sense for him to have a flush on both. So when he bets 225 here on this river, unfortunately, we just snap fold our hand. Have I finally found the edge of the bluffing cliff? Hello. I'm not sure, but let's jump into this hand. Let's talk about it. We open to 25 in the low jack with 9-7 of clubs here. The hijack Euro Pro is going to go 85 doll hairs here. And at this point, I'm probably just done with this. I'm probably just folding this hand. But then something interesting happens. A recreational player in the small blind is going to call. So I wouldn't continue with this, heads up, but I think just multi-way now, we're getting a pretty good price. And so we elect to call after the small blind cold calls the 3-bet. Flop comes deuce jack 4 with a couple of clubs. We both check it over to the pre-flop raiser, who goes 85. The small blind calls the next to act. Obviously, we can't fold here right away to the small bet with a flush draw. I'd kind of like to see what happens. I don't really want to pile in all the money with this hand. On top of that, when the hijack bets on this flop into 2 other people, he probably just has a pretty good hand here, probably looking like overpairs, queens, kings, aces, stuff like that. So after the small blind calls, I'm just going to proceed cautiously. I continue as a call. Turn now is an offsuit ace. The small blind checks, we check it over, and now the hijack is going to check back. So now I think at this point, the hijack most likely has a lot of hands like queens, kings, jacks, stuff like that. The river is a 3 of spades. And now, interestingly, the small blind is going to lead for 165. Fear and greed drives people's decisions in live poker. If he had a set here, he would just bet big on this river. If he had like jacks or something like that, he would just bet big. If he had like ace jack, I think he would just bet bigger. Feels squarely like a hand like ace queen, ace 10 suited. And I think on this board, we can just credibly rep a straight or 2 pair a lot of the time here. This may look a little bit kamikaze, but this feels like a very good spot to bluff. So when the small blind goes 165, I jam for 795 effective here with 9 high. Hijack is going to get out of the way, and now it gets back around to the small blind, and I don't like what's going on here. He's asking how much. He looks like he's going to call. This guy is definitely going to call. Like, I know he's going to call, and I'm thinking, ah, shit, what can I do? What can I do? So I start talking here, and you hear me say,
What do you have?
What do I have?
Yeah,
What do you have?
I have a straight. But I don't have the nut straight.
but unfortunately, my talking does not work. It doesn't change his mind. He puts in the call, and he calls us with ace queen of diamonds. So don't have much experience with this player, but seems like not a great player to bluff. So this is probably the guy you gotta go for max value against very, very thinly. But we go tumbling down the edge of the exploit cliff just a little bit here, and we get stacked by the exact type of hand that we were targeting to fold. All right, just a couple hands later here, so going to take advantage of some live dynamics in this one. Playing straight 5-5, we open it up on the button with ace-10 offsuit to 25, and the big blind is going to call. Flop comes 3-6-6 with a couple of hearts. He checks it over. My MO on the flop is just going to be to range bet in almost every situation. I want to choose a size where they raise their strong shit, call it their weak shit, usually around half pot. So I go half pot, he calls. Turn is the 8 of spades. I think in a wide configuration, single raise pot in position, button versus big blind, we just have a ton of showdown value here, right? So we are going to check it back with the plan of bluff catching a lot of rivers if he chooses a smaller size. Now the river is an ace, and when he checks it over, normally on this river, I would go small, but this was about 4 hands after we just got stacked. So I think here people just aren't going to believe me. So into a pot of 100 on this river, I actually just bet $100 here, just planning on people to think, oh, this guy's tilted. He's just bluffing too much. He just got caught bluffing. So I go 100. Guy puts in a pretty quick call, and we are good with ace-10. Thin value alert. All right, so here we go. We open to $20 under the gun with King Jack. The hijack and big blind are going to call. Flop comes 10-9-6 with a couple of diamonds. We've got 2 overs and a gutter, but I generally just like checking most of my hands when I'm out of position to one player and in position to one player here. Probably bet here if I had a hand that was vulnerable value, like an overpair or top pair, top kicker or something like that. But most of my other hands, I'm probably just checking here, including a lot of my very strong hands here going for the check raise. So I check, hijack goes 30 and the big blind calls. So I am going to elect to call here. We are going 3 ways to the turn, which is a 7 of diamonds, bringing in a 1-liner, and this turn is going to check through. Now the river is the queen of clubs. The big blind comes out and bets $50 here, and I think we just always have the best hand when the big blind chooses 50 into 150. I think if he did have a flush here, he would choose a bigger size. To me, this is just almost always going to be an 8 or maybe 2 pair or something like that. So I think it's gonna be a smaller straight or 2 pair almost all the time. I don't wanna go too big here because we do have value. I wanna go relatively small here. I wanna get an 8 to call, and he does call. We flip over our hand and we are good, getting some nice thin value. Next hand here, this is the biggest pot of the session, and it is absolutely ridiculous. So let's jump in. The low jack makes it $30, and this is a player that had been raising to 20 or 25 quite a bit. So when he opens to 30, this is just going to be a very strong hand, and we look down at pocket aces here on the button, so just a dream spot. And I think 3-betting to like 90 or 100 here is just a big mistake. I think maybe just going like 200 here, I think we can get away with it. When he opens to 30, just going to be strong hands, right? He has an open size to 20, he has an open size to 30. The strong hands are going to be in the 30 size, right? So we go 160, and now the big blind here, you're gonna see him hem and haul and think about it, and he's going to cold call the 160. So we are loving this so far. Now the low jack, the original opener, he is going to call as well. So we are going 3 ways to the flop. Already a big bloated pot here. Pot is $480. Flop comes queen 7-7 with a couple of spades, checks over to us on the button, and I want to choose a size to make sure hands like 10s, jacks, 9s, just always continue at least one time on this flop. So I go 200 into 480. Now the big blind is going to call next to act, and now the low jack jams for $1,355. And at this point, when the low jack jams here, he's never going to have a hand like pocket queens. Pocket queens is not going to do this, right? Queens would either want to slow play or raise very small here. Queens is not terrified of anything. Queens does not want to pile in the money. It doesn't want to scare away hands. So he doesn't have queens. Now, could he have a 7? Well, remember, he opened to 30 from early position here from the low jack. When he opens this big size, it's usually going to be stronger hands. What type of strong hands have a 7? So he doesn't have a 7. So we are just not really worried about the low jack here. The big blind cold called pre-flop, and what type of hands do people cold call? Hands like 9s, 10s, jacks, queens. Now he called next to act on the flop. So we're a little bit worried about the big blind possibly showing up with pocket queens here occasionally. We don't think he's ever gonna have a 7 when he cold calls this big size pre-flop, but he could have queens some of the time. But he just has a lot more combos, I think, the big blind, of hands like jacks, 10s, 9s, even pocket kings occasionally. After walking through everything, I just think we are likely to have the best hand here a lot of the time. So after deliberating, I am going to put in the call here with pocket aces. Now the big blind is not going to snap call, which is a huge win for us. So now we are sure we have the best hand, but the big blind is going to think for a couple minutes, and then he is going to put in the call as well. We are 3 ways here. All the money is in. We have a $4,000 pot at 5-5. The turn is a 3 of spades. We hate to see it because we think at least one of these players probably has an ace high flush draw. Now the river is an 8 of spades, so I mean, I can't think of a worse run out than this. And look at this. The big blind shows aces with the ace of spades. So we cold called the 3-bet with the ace of spades, and the low jack has kings with the king of spades. So we lose the main pot to pocket aces, and since the low jack covered the big blind, we lose the side pot to pocket kings with the king of spades. So we have aces against aces and kings, and somehow we lose to both players in this spot. All right, next hand here, another relatively annoying spot, just a really tough spot here. So under the gun goes $20. The low jack calls. We look down at ace king of spades here in the big blind. We are going to squeeze. We put in a pretty big squeeze here. There's just a couple hands after we got stacked with aces. I think the table is not going to give us credit here. So we make it 185 with ace king of spades. Under the gun folds. Now surprising, the low jack double calls. And what is this going to be when they double call? Well, it's going to be a lot of suited broadways and pocket pairs, right? So we are going to a flop heads up. It comes king, jack, 4 with 3 clubs here. I think just betting here is probably better. We can just go bet here and very easily get the money in. Not as much incentive to check, but I think I just get a little bit on autopilot mode and check here. And now something interesting happens. After we check, the low jack jams all in for $820 into 390. So he jams 2x pot. I think this is just fear. I think this is just going to be a lot of hands like 2 pair or a set that are just scared of a bad card coming. So I think a lot of the time this is just going to be a hand like king jack suited, maybe a hand like pocket 4s. The other hands that would make sense would be the ace of clubs here, just this stiff ace of clubs. We are either way behind to a hand like king jack or pocket 4s, or we are essentially flipping with a hand like ace queen with a club or ace 10 with a club. And I know this looks like a nitty fold when we have top pair, top kicker, but the way I like to phrase these things is when we are over folding in this spot, it is not because we are nitty, it's because our opponents are nitty. We are essentially saying, excuse me, sir, I do not respect you enough to think you have enough bluffs for this size in this configuration, in this line. So that's essentially what we're doing here. I think essentially we are just either flipping or drawing very thin. So I am going to make a big fold here. Next hand here, we go 20 on the button with pocket queens, and the big blind is going to call. This is the same guy who stacked us in the hand with pocket aces when he cold called. Flop here comes deuce 3-9 with a couple of hearts. He checks it over. We go 25 into 40 here, just choosing the size where he's going to raise his strong shit, call with his weak shit, and that's what he does. He raises to 75 here. I like to always consider the options, but I think by bet 3-betting with queens here, I think it's just a little bit too thin. We're going to get him to fold his hands like 9x or pocket 10s here, and yeah, we would get value from his draws, but his draws will probably just keep barreling anyway, and his draws probably don't always even check raise flop at a high frequency. So we elect to call here. Turn here is a 3 of diamonds pairing the board. Pretty good card for us because it reduces his value combos quite a lot. Now at this point, we probably just think he has a lot of 9x, maybe some pocket 10, stuff like that. So he goes 130, and we again are going to call. Now the river is the 4 of diamonds, bringing in a backdoor diamond draw, and when he checks it over to us, at this point we think we always have the best hand. If I was bluffing, what size would I bluff here? And I don't think I would need to choose a massive size here because there was no front door draw that missed. I don't think I need to go too big to make 9x fold here, so I'm not sure I can choose an egregious size for value. So I'm actually going to elect to go 250. I just want to make sure that 9x or pocket 10s call. He's going to think about it for a few seconds, flick in the call. We show pocket queens and we are good. All right, next hand here, the low jack, hijack, cutoff, and button limp. The small blind makes it 30, which is a very, very small size over 1, 2, 3, 4 limps. So we think the small blind is just not that strong. This kind of seems like a pot sweetener type raise here. We look down at ace jack off in the big blind, and this is a little bit light, but I think once the small blind has told us he doesn't really have a super strong hand and 14 players have limped, I think this is pretty good. We just want to 3-bet here, knock out all of the limpers, play a pot heads up in position. So I'm gonna choose a small 3-bet size here. The goal here isn't to get the small blind to fold. The goal here is to get all the limpers to fold, but that's not what happens. The first 3 limpers fold, and the button limper, who over-limped after 3 limps in front of him, he decides now to go all in for 545. This guy has been super gambly. He is a well-known rapper, actually, and we just think he's kind of full of shit here. He's gone all in quite a few times, so when he goes all in for 545, we think ace jack is quite good enough just to put in all the money here, and so we call it off, and he says,
Super.
well, you win some, you lose some, but mostly we seem to be losing some, and not much we can do here. We get the money in good, and he hits his 2 pair. All right, next hand here, under the gun makes it 25, and you guys know my MO by this point is to 3-bet, play pots heads up in position against recreational players. So we are going to make it 75 here with queen jack of hearts, and we are going to go heads up to a flop. Flop comes jack 8-8 rainbow, and when he checks it over, my MO in 3-bet pots is just going to be a range bet in position. Going to choose a smaller size in 3-bet pots because the absolute size of the pot is bigger. So we go $50, and interestingly, he is going to check raise to 150 now. We think when we choose a small size, this can induce some spazzes sometimes, can induce maybe some worse hands to raise, can induce maybe some draws to raise occasionally, maybe just some pocket pairs to raise. So we're going to call here with top pair and a backdoor flush draw, and now the turn is a deuce of spades. He goes 250 here into 455, so just over half pot, and this is going to be the size that recreational players in general telegraph weakness, so we are going to call once again with top pair. Now the river is a jack of spades, so we have jacks full. He bets 220. Obviously, we just think we have the nuts here. It seems very unlikely that he has pocket 8s, so at this point I'm just going to try to put in a very small raise to try to get looked up by a hand like pocket 9s or pocket 10s.
How big's your pair? Because if it's under 8, it's counterfeit.
So I specifically tell this guy, you know, don't call me if you have pocket 6s. That hand is counterfeit, just kind of joking around. And he actually ends up folding a couple minutes later and says that he actually had pocket 6s. So I don't know. I don't know if I think he's being serious. I'm not really sure. Who knows? Next hand here, we open up ace-10 offsuit to 25 from UTG. The small blind and big blind are both going to call here. We go to a flop, which comes ace 3-9 with a couple of clubs. In general, I like to use an overbet strategy when players aren't going to raise off their strong shit and aren't going to call with their weak shit. And I think that's the case on a lot of these ace high flops. So I actually check this one back on the flop, planning to just kind of use the information they give me on the turn when they tell me their hand strength with their bet sizing and their actions. So we go to a turn, the small blind bets 35, the big blind calls, and I think we have a pretty clear call here. Maybe if I had ace jack or ace queen, would consider raising, but with ace 10, I just call. We go to a river, which is a 3 of hearts, and both players check it over to me. I just don't think an ace is folding even to a big size. Recreational players in general check the river to check call, so I want to target an ace here. I go 200 into 180, choosing a overbet size, targeting all of the ace X that we beat, and the big blind is going to think it over for a moment or two. He's going to put in the call, and we are good, getting some nice overbet value on this river with our ace 10. Next hand here, this one was frustrating, and I think I made maybe a little bit of an error on the river, which we will talk about, so let's jump in. We open up ace jack offsuit to 25 in the low jack, the hijack in the small blind call. We're going to a flop, which comes king 4-8, so nothing really going on for us. When the small blind checks it over, we check as well, and the hijack checks it back. Now the turn is the ace of diamonds. We most likely have the best ace here. And I don't think either player's folding an ace. I don't think either player's folding a diamond draw. 125 into 75 here, so the big overbet. The hijack's gonna get out of the way and the small blind is going to call. Now the river is a 7 of hearts, and interestingly, the small blind is now gonna donk for 135. When he takes a size, I think for value, he's just repping like single pair ace X, and I think we just beat all of the ace X pretty much. And I think if he had 2 pair, he would take a bigger size. And I think we just beat all of the draws here. So in game, my only consideration in this spot was, we beat all of his bluffs. I'm pretty sure we beat most of his value when he chooses a size. So let's just call here. I think maybe if I took a few more seconds, I possibly could have even just considered a bluff raise here, maybe being a little bit results oriented, because we do call in this spot, just expecting to see a worse ace or a busted draw a lot. And unfortunately, he just owns us. He shows us ace queen, double board bomb pot alert. All right, double board bomb pot, only 5 players in this one. So pot is 125, $25 ante each. And in this one, we've got ace queen 10-3 with the queen and 3 of clubs. And board 1 comes 8 ace king. So we just have a top pair and a gutter going on up there. Bottom board comes queen 5-4 with the 5 and 4 of clubs. So we've got top pair and a queen high flush draw going on this board. And when it checks to us in the cutoff here, I'm just going to check. We don't really have a super strong hand on either board at this point, but we would really love to see a turn. So we check it over. The button bet's 100, MP calls, and I think at this point we have a pretty clear call as well, with top pair on each board, a flush draw on the bottom board, and a draw to the nuts, however thin it is, on board 1. Getting a good price here, we are going to call as well. We go to a turn, which is pretty good. On the top board for us is the jack of spades. So now we have the nut Broadway straight on the top board, and the bottom board is the 8 of clubs. So now we have the queen high flush on the bottom board. So we've got the nuts on the top board and the third nuts on the second board. And when MP checks it over, at this point, we are just going to pot it for 425, put some pressure on the button, put some pressure on MP. The button is going to call, and now interestingly, the small blind moves all in for 1180. And I think at this point, it is pretty obvious the small blind most likely has a hand like ace X of clubs. That makes a lot of sense here. And I'm kind of close between just calling and jamming, because I'm not sure if I really mind the button coming along here. Obviously, we're ahead of the button on at least one of these boards, but I don't really want to give the button a price to come along if he's got like a set on one board and 2 pair on the other or something like that. And I don't know, this is a close spot. I'm not the best at double board PLO, I will admit. This game is not my specialty, but I decided just to put all the money in, because when the small blind moves all in for 1180, we've only got about 700 more effective with the button. So button folds, and the river is a queen of hearts up top and a king of spades down below. And it doesn't matter because MP shows 6-7 of clubs. So he has a straight flush on board 2, and he has nothing on the first board. So we are just going to chop up the button's money here. Next hand here, this may be a blender. Maybe I was getting a little bit tired. The straddle is on. Under the gun makes it 30. Recreational player. We've got ace-9 of spades in the cutoff. Like to isolate the recreational players, get it heads up in position. So that's what we do here. We make it 90 in the cutoff with ace-9 of spades, but the big blind is going to cold call, and under the gun comes along as well. So 3 ways to the flop, which comes 3 king 8. And when they both check it over to us, usually in this spot, I probably just check it back with not a lot going on. But on this board, on the king high boards, I just think we get a lot of credit as the pre-flop 3-better. I think we're gonna get a lot of folds on this flop, if not the flop, then on the turn. And normally I wouldn't bet this, but we do have the backdoor nut flush draw, and we've got an overcard as well. So we do have a little bit of a get out of jail free card. So we go 110 here. Thankfully, the big blind folds. He just gets out of the way. So probably hand like ace queen or something like that. And now the under the gun player calls. So now we go to a turn, which is the 4 of diamonds, a complete blank here. And I want to choose a size on the turn to entice under the gun to still continue with with hands like pocket 9s, pocket 10s, pocket jacks, 8x, hands like that. So I go really, really small here, planning to leave behind a big bet on the river to get him to fold out anything except king X. So I go 130 here on this turn. He thinks it over and flicks in the call. Now the river is a 6 of clubs, and when he checks it over, at this point, we're not getting a hand like ace king or king queen to fold ever at this stack depth, but I do believe I can get hands like 10s, 9s, jacks, queens, 8x, all these hands to fold at nearly 100% frequency. Now the question is, do I need to jam to do this? I'm not quite sure. My image is not the best at this point. I've 3-bet this guy maybe the last couple times he's open, so I do think I need a little bit more firepower to do this. So I actually decide to jam here, and he pretty much snaps it off, and he has 8-6 of spades, and immediately he starts talking.
6 didn't come. I was calling you down, homeboy.
Don't believe that.
So obviously just pretty shit luck here to run into a river 2-pair. And when people say stuff like, I was gonna call you down no matter what, believe what people do, don't believe what people say. Like, people aren't gonna call you down with an 8 here. People aren't gonna call you down with pocket 9s here. It's never gonna happen in a million years.
All right, pretty rough session overall. Ran pretty poorly today. Made a couple big bluffs that just didn't work. Just a pretty shitty session. Not having fun today. Played 12 hours, we'll put the results here or somewhere. Not the most fun session. Honestly, the hardest part of all of this is dealing with the people. Not the best, but we'll be back at it. We'll be back at it soon. All right, see you guys.